All right. As I've stated many times, conflict perspective, one of my, if not my favorite perspective and theoretical framework to look at situations from. It's really drawing attention to conflict, inequality, dominance, and oppression in social life. And so I talked a little bit about it in class, but every situation that you kind of look at and engage in, there is some sort of potential power differential, whether it's intentional or not intentional. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes it's put into place to manipulate or dictate behavior for better or for worse. So, some of those key points in this perspective is that all social systems have inequalities in the distribution of valued resource. A lot of times that's looked at specifically in monetary values. Conflict perspective kind of grew out of looking at capitalism and Karl Marx and kind of the labor force, but you could also look into, you could even look like a mom with multiple children having their kids fight for the valued resource of their mother's attention. So one might act out because they value the attention. And one way to get that is to act out, because even if you're getting negative attention, you're still getting attention. So looking at power is unequally divided, and that powerful social groups impose their will on non-dominant groups. And so this could be looked at as a worker who's paying very low wages in order to get the most profits from the products that their workers are creating. Often the people in power are looking to maintain the status quo because it gives them sort of advantage or benefit by having it and having it operate in that way. Oftentimes the non-dominant group might not even be aware of the inequality, and that's where social movements become very important. Conflict and the potential for conflict underlie unequal social relationships. This unequal social relationships can often result in non-dominant groups becoming alienated from society. But social change may occur and can occur when non-dominant groups recognize patterns of inequality and injustice and then take some sort of action to challenge the status quo to increase their power. There's a lot of related perspectives to the conflict theory and conflict perspective. One that gets talked about a lot, it's kind of been a hot topic in education, is the critical race theory. And so that is specifically looking at racism and how and why it exists, and kind of the inequality and power and control pieces that are related to racism and how that's influencing society, and questioning why it is even still present in society when you have so many civil rights movements and civil rights laws. How and why does racism still exist? And so the feminist theory also is in the same kind of vein, but they're looking at gender inequality, specifically in the two traditional genders, male, female. Why, like in a society, are there a lot of male dominance versus female? Thinking about wages and different pay based on gender. But it's important to note within that there's even subsets that those who all identify as the same gender might not have the same equal rights or equality within the same gender as well. So that's one of the positives that we'll talk about in this slide, is that it does kind of incorporate in a lot of room for diversity and specifically challenging inequality, because that's like the root of what this whole theory is looking at the power differential and inequalities. So it's pretty straightforward. You can look at it at all different levels, and it's essential to promoting social justice because it does encourage and recognize that there's this historical and time piece to it, but also immobilizes and empowers individuals. One of the weaknesses is that those straightforward concepts that I really like about it, they become a little muddied because is power and privilege objective material, or is it subjective to the person experiencing it? So there's all this jokes about millennials feeling entitled to a certain pay just because they feel like they're doing the job, they should get X amount of hours or dollars an hour, where individuals who might be in an older generation don't think that they need that much money et cetera, et cetera. So is the power differential subjective or objective? It's something to keep in mind. I love this visual. It kind of shows some of those things. If you're in a privileged group, things that you might have access to. If you are in the non-dominant group, you might feel some alienation, room for collective action, experience the actual conflict. Microaggressions is a term that gets used a lot within the conflict perspective. So those are those like indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination pieces against members of a marginalized group. So I like to use the example of flesh-colored Band-Aids. So the flesh color for most Band-Aids are a lighter skin tone. And so what message is that sending to individuals who might not have the same skin tone? And so that's kind of the indirect or sometimes unintentional discrimination based on an action. Why is this important to social work? It does shine a light on domination and oppression and how people kind of act out when, not necessarily act out, that sounds negative, but their responses are when they're feeling oppressed. Is it empowering, or is it something that can feed into a negative narrative about oneself? And so it does encourage us to look at the power dynamic we might have with clients. So for me personally, I come from my race, I'm white, often is one who holds the power, if not usually always. And so when I work with clients who are an ethnic minority, how does my race, how might they view it? How might I unintentionally view it? What assumptions might I have about individuals who come from a different race or socioeconomical status as I? I've always had access to a car and have my driver's license, so I don't always understand the nuances of having to ride the bus or finding a ride. And so if I get upset or judge a client because they're late or didn't make it to an appointment, my position of privilege might create a false narrative where the individual might have missed the bus, or the bus was late, or they didn't have somebody to watch their kids so they could get a ride, or they ran out of bus tickets because they used their bus tickets to get food. So kind of looking at how your privilege or your power might influence your perception of clients. Because there is this kind of call towards like collective action and challenging the status quo, it can be very empowering for clients to recognize that some of their situations might be because of oppression, not necessarily just that they're not contributing to society or are a bad person per se. And so seeing it from that lens can be very empowering because it gives them the opportunity to advocate for themselves and possibly join in some sort of social movement. Conflict theory.